This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority.
Welcome to today's meeting of the Housing Committee. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on social media and use the hashtag London Housing for this meeting. Please may I remind participants to silence your devices. Our main item of business this morning is a discussion on rough sleeping in London. Before we begin, we have a few short items of business. Can I now ask our clerk, Diane Richards, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received today from Assemblymember Bath, for whom Assemblymember Terrell will be substituting.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare?
Noted and no.
Okay. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 18th of September 2024?
Agreed.
Can we note the outstanding actions arising from previous meetings?
Noted.
Can we note the action taken by me as chair under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members to agree the Affordable Housing Monitor 2024? Great. So that brings us to our main item of business, rough sleeping in London. Can I please welcome our first panel of guests? It's great to see you all here. We have Molly Bishop, Head of Implementation at the Centre for Homelessness Impact, Jasmine Bazran, Head of Policy and Campaigns at Crisis, Alexia Murphy, Chief Executive Officer of DePaul UK, Simone Strachan will be joining us, and she is London Hub Strategic Lead at Shelter, and finally Michelle Binfield, Rough Sleeping Programme Director at London Councils. So welcome to you all. So I will take the first question and then my colleagues will come in after that. So to all of you, I suppose, what are the main causes of rough sleeping in London and why has there been an increase in recent years? So maybe we'll start with Molly and then move across the panel.
Thank you. Yes, so, I mean, the increase in recent years is obviously extremely stark. Rough sleeping has increased by 58% over the last 10 years, so from 2014 to 2024. The vast majority of people sleeping rough do so reporting that their last settled address was with friends and family, so informal living situations. The second main reason, people leaving private rented sector. And And then we kind of fall into a range of different categories, and there have been some changes in trends there, with a real increase in the number of people sleeping rough who were previously in Home Office asylum accommodation within the last 85 days. And I think what's important when we're looking at the causes is that the data that we do have is obviously always going to be limited by collection methods and by the number of contacts that people have with outreach services. And one thing that we would like to flag today is around kind of data quality and thinking about levels of hidden homelessness and rough sleeping that may not be available immediately on the statistics that are routinely collected through Chain in London and other methods by local authorities. Something that we can perhaps come back into a little bit later.
Thank you. Jasmine?
Thank you. Completely echo the causes kind of Molly's highlighted there. I think in addition, we also see pressures driven by the social security system really contributing to this, and particularly in London, the impact of the benefit cap. So we see that more, I would say, as a reason we can't move people on. So it's really hampering resolutions to rough sleeping and being able to place people into private renter sector accommodation. And there are similar issues that we see with the shared accommodation rate, which particularly affects young people. And what we're increasingly seeing is, in London in particular, we have landlords who are providing a room and shared kitchens, but charging that rent at a one-bedroom local housing allowance rate. And what that then results in is that people receiving the shared accommodation rate obviously have a really significant shortfall in what they receive versus what they need to rent, and are struggling to kind of make up that gap and therefore can't rent. And that obviously also contributes to rental arrears. And then the biggest cause that we have seen in recent months across our 3 services in London has been some of the decisions around asylum, people who are newly granted asylum status, and there was obviously changes in practice, and that led to a really significant increase, and we're still continuing to see high numbers of newly recognised refugees needing that support with very limited options for move on.
I won't repeat anything that my colleagues have said, but I concur entirely. And you've got some big picture stuff there. I might be able to give you some little picture numbers. DePaul did a... okay, sorry. Better? I was getting away.
You can lift the base and move it towards you if that's easier.
Okay, you hear me now? We did a youth census pilot. We were alarmed at the spike in rough sleeping numbers on Chain amongst young people. So in August, we undertook a young person's rough sleeping census to try and get a sense of what was going on. And we just did a dip test in 3 boroughs, Camden, Lambeth and Bromley. And we worked with our partners, New Horizon Youth Centre and Thames Reach, and they delivered the questionnaire to young people who said they had been sleeping rough, who were in contact with services that those organisations are working in. Of the 40 people that we spoke to over the course of a few days, 9 had come straight to rough sleeping from asylum seeker accommodation. 8 had come straight from the family home, family breakdown, overcrowding, cost of living pressures in family homes. 5 had come from hotels and B&Bs where they'd been placed by their local authority. 4 had come from the private rented sector for issues of affordability and eviction or threatened eviction. 3 came straight from sofa surfing, having lived in temporary living arrangements like that for some months. And then 2 came each from hostels, from foster care, from families and long-standing friends where they had been, again, sofa surfing, prison and hospital. The latter 2 were just 1 from each of those areas. So that gives you an indication of where people are coming from to sleep, where young people are coming from to sleep rough.
Thank you. And Michelle?
Thank you. I concur with what colleagues have said, absolutely. The data is very clear. I think underpinning some of the relationship and family breakdown, though, that is the reason listed within the statistics for people becoming homeless. Even underneath that, it's usually an issue of financial insecurity. You know, many people have relationship breakdowns in their life, but not everybody ends up homeless. So generally, it's about the lack of a safety net, about the lack of the ability to withstand an income shock, the lack of savings, and those kind of things that leads relationship and family breakdown to lead to homelessness. And I think just to say the rise in rough sleeping is obviously matched by a growing and much wider crisis in all forms of homelessness. And rough sleeping is the sharpest and most sort of dangerous end of homelessness. But as we see in London councils, there is a crisis across the capital linked to mostly the system issues, supply issues, particularly access to the PRS, and the issues that colleagues have referred to around that affordability gap, with rents rising faster than benefits and income, and that's causing, you know, debt, arrears, and a lot again of that loss of private rented sector accommodation is linked to just an inability to afford rent, getting into debt, and getting evicted. I think that local authorities have lost so much of the sort of preventative and protective work that they used to do to prevent rough sleeping. Since 2010, the last 14 years, the cuts to local authority budgets have been deep, and quite a lot of that core funding that was lost to London local authorities was spent on things like tenancy support, things like welfare advice, debt advice, housing advice, the sort of protective services that would have prevented a lot of that rough sleeping and a lot of that wider homelessness. And I think until we get back to a place where we're offering something to people before they lose their tenancy, it's going to be really difficult to slow that increase in new rough sleeping and other forms of homelessness.
Thank you all. You've all mentioned, in one way or another, the private rented sector and its role in homelessness. So what impact do you think the government's Renters' Rights Bill, which is set to finally end Section 21, no-fault evictions, will have on rough sleeping? And you don't have to stick to just Section 21, so it'd be good to hear your analysis of the benefits or disbenefits of that bill. We start again with Molly.
Yeah, so I think it's hard to draw a direct line at this point in time in terms of what that will do to rough sleeping. I think homelessness in general, it will give people more time to prevent their homelessness, where they're in a situation where the landlord is looking to evict for one reason or another. It's one of those sort of easy routes that they won't be able to draw on and won't be able to happen quickly. One of the key challenges in terms of people being given Section 28 notices is that 21 notices is that they approach the local authority with such a short amount of time in order to be able to receive support, whether that's financial or mediation or otherwise. So the impact that this will have in terms of potentially lengthening that amount of time that people have to get support, and obviously hopefully reducing the number of landlords that are pursuing eviction if that route is closed, is a positive, and we hope that that will have an impact on overall drivers into homelessness. As I say, drawing that link all the way through to rough sleeping is a difficult one to do, and as other colleagues have mentioned, that's more to do with the wider security net that people have around them, their financial security, friends and family, to fall back on, the opportunities to make money, and those things, you know, those wider things don't change as a result of the Act. So it's welcome that there's a strengthening of rights for tenants. It's that route from people having tenancies to becoming homelessness that is so prevalent in terms of approaches to local authorities and people ending up rough sleeping. But yeah, that specific link all the way through is as yet unclear.
Okay, thank you. Jasmine?
I think similarly on rough sleeping specifically, it is going to be a little bit difficult. We do see the Act as very positive and providing strengthened rights for people, and particularly around notice periods, and really would want that to kind of retain as that Act goes through those lengthened notice period times. I think perhaps The thing in addition I would raise is we are seeing, particularly in London, the affordability of the private rented sector really driving rough sleeping and wider kind of forms of homelessness and preventing people from moving on. And whilst there are provisions in the Act that will kind of allow for people to challenge what's termed as unreasonable rent increases, and I know the government is looking at the tribunal system and how this works, I think we still have outstanding concerns about the strength of that and how whether that will actually prevent kind of people from having to leave a property because of the affordability of the rent. So we are asking the government to explore looking at limiting in-tenancy rent increases as a first measure to give strengthened rights to people, because it is as yet unclear how this will work through if it relies on the tenant to feel confident and empowered and know enough about their rights to take forward a challenge to the landlord. So we are concerned about that element of it, and I think in London that will be borne out particularly kind of starkly given the current situation.
Thank you. Alexia, please.
Likewise, we welcome the Act, but are unable to see the direct link to rough sleeping quickly. I would say that PRS in itself is very difficult for young people to act. It's probably one of our single biggest challenges as an organisation, moving people on from our supported accommodation services, including those funded through the GLA. I would also say that for young people, they have a very specific need around understanding the legal process of eviction. And one of the areas of work we do with young people is around understanding notices. So if they receive some sort of formal letter from a landlord, it may not be a legally compliant notice, but they will abandon quickly rather than try and see through a legal process that they're afraid. So abandonment, even before eviction properly starts or is even legally allowed to start, is an issue for my client group specifically.
I think London councils have just released today, I believe it is, a report funded by the Trust for London with Savills, which talks about just the falling supply in the private rented sector across the board. It's quite interesting just in terms of the number of listings and how they've reduced over the recent period, and also just the affordability of the PRS. Such a small proportion of PRS accommodation in London is affordable to people who are on benefits. It's hardly affordable to people that are working, but certainly the benefit system works against accessing that kind of accommodation. I think with the Renters' Rights Bill, we need to watch it very carefully. We work very well together as London boroughs and the Mayor in London, and I think we need to do what the West Midlands are doing and commission perhaps some research to look at landlord intentions and landlord behaviour in the face of that new legislation. It may be, to begin with, that there's a bit of a shock in terms of people leaving the market in response to the legislation, though ultimately the benefits in the medium and long term will be positive for tenants. But I think we really do need to understand landlord intentions and landlord behaviour. We're seeing with exempt supported accommodation and the regulations that were brought in, again, very positive about increasing the quality of that accommodation and regulating it better. What we are seeing is a lot of landlords exiting that market and ending tenancies and a sort of short-term homelessness pressure. And we want to try and avoid that, obviously, with the Renters' Rights Bill, likewise. And I think one of the things, just on the shared accommodation rate and young people, such a growing demographic within rough sleeping, I think the shared accommodation rate is a sort of odd bit of legislation. If you stay in a homeless hostel for 12 weeks, you can get an exemption from that shared accommodation rate. But if you stay in an asylum support hotel for not 12 weeks but 2 years, or if you stay in prison leaver accommodation like CAS 3, that exemption does not apply to you. So there's sort of some gaps and weirdnesses within the system attached to the shared accommodation rate that could easily be addressed with guidance, possibly, to provide that exemption to young refugees, to provide that exemption to young prison leavers who've spent 12 weeks in other forms of accommodation, which are very like hostels. And not to doing that means that rough sleepers who are young are having to go into hostels, expensive 24-hour hostels, to qualify for that exemption, to get private rented sector accommodation when they don't need that supported accommodation. It's such an inefficient use of scarce resources that I think that needs more attention.
Just before I hand over, Michelle, you said that the West Midlands have commissioned research on landlord behaviour. Is that something that you'd anticipate that the GLA would do in partnership with London councils or with the sector? How would that work?
I think it's the West Midlands Combined Authority that have commissioned, they're commissioning it right now. I think they're seeking a research partner. London Councils has done some work with Savills in the past in this space, so it could be something that London Councils and the Mayor could collaborate on. Obviously there's always a resource issue, but it's not a massive amount of resources, but it seems like a very good thing to do. We're watching what West Midlands are doing with interest, and we've seen their specification, so we are interested in seeing whether that could be applied in our area.
Okay, thank you. I'll hand over now to Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Good morning to you all. I'm going to address my questions to Molly and Alexia, in the first instance, and maybe if somebody else feels like there's a contribution or something missed, please do chime in. What additional support should the Mayor provide to address the growing demographic challenges in rough sleeping in London, such as the high number of new rough sleepers who are non-UK nationals, the increasing number of young men who seem to be rough sleeping as well? Is there any particular things that the Mayor could do to support them?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the Mayor's role, obviously it's what we're here to discuss today, but the Mayor's role within this is really important to view, thinking about the whole homelessness system within London. So local authorities hold statutory responsibility. We know that for rough sleeping, a lot of people aren't held within that net of statutory homelessness and don't therefore get access to statutory temporary accommodation and some of the support that can come with that. So the Mayor's role to date has obviously really been focused in overlaying the statutory homelessness system with support around rough sleeping. And I think as much as that has its benefits, it also has its challenges in terms of the fact that we've essentially got two separate homelessness systems running alongside each other. One that draws people in who are deemed to have the highest level of need under the law, and one that supports people who fall outside of our legal framework but nonetheless have got, in the most part, fairly significant needs and will rough sleep. So I think the Mayor's role when it comes to new rough sleeping, specific demographics, has to take into consideration what role he can play most effectively to bring that whole system together and stop sort of some of these perverse incentives and bits of the system that don't seem to make sense that Michelle's just mentioned in terms of policies and access to benefits that create pockets of inefficiency. And for non-UK nationals specifically, so we can absolutely see that the numbers of people who are sleeping rough, non-UK nationals, has gone up significantly, and we now have, let me just check the figures, we have 41% of UK nationals rough sleep in London, but the share of people from Asia and Africa has increased from 4.8 to 9.4 and 6.1 to 14.9 respectively. And of non-UK nationals, the highest nationality group is Eritreans, so 6%, Poles 5%, and then people from Sudan 4%. And within that, you've got kind of different cohorts, and this is one of the challenges of talking about non-UK nationals rough sleeping, is that you've got people from the EEA, so from EU countries who don't have the same rights as they did pre-Brexit, and then you've also got people from other areas of the world. The vast majority of those who are rough sleeping in London are
either newly accepted refugees or failed asylum seekers, and that's where the no recourse to public funds challenge comes in. So there is a challenge with holding this as a single group. I think the Mayor's done some really good work in specialist immigration advice and support at a sub-regional level, and that's something that the Centre, along with national government, have chosen to hone in on and run a control trial and a test and learn pilot on to understand the effectiveness of it and try and build some evidence around impact there. And we've got hopes that will be really positive and will enable some scale. So there is some good practice there. But more generally, kind of coming back to the whole systems point and the role that the Mayor can most usefully play, I think there is something in the ability to convene the whole homelessness system, so the work that local authorities need to focus in on when it comes to statutory homelessness, but also the things that they can't or don't currently have the resource to do, to look beyond that. When it comes to prevention, there's this big gap between single people who are homeless, who do have a statutory responsibility at a local authority level, and those that don't have that, and we only see them within the system when they start rough sleeping. There's a massive gap there that needs to be filled in order for us to be able to genuinely prevent rough sleeping earlier on. And so there are areas that we feel that the Mayor, as a convener, as a system leader, as somebody that can pull partners together across London and then support a single voice into government, has got a really important role to play.
Thank you. Alexia, anything you'd like to add?
Yes. In the next few weeks, the Mayor could, and I assume he already is, campaign to MHCLG regarding the RSI funding, which is at the moment scheduled to end on the 31st of March, and providers like my own organisation and many others in London who are funding Rough Sleeper Initiative funded services, housing, outreach, so on, do not know at the moment whether those services will be funded on the 1st of April and whether we need to start closing down those services. That would lead to a spike in rough sleeping. So that would be my first. And I'm sure we know that we're working with the Mayor and MHCLG to try and get an answer to that. Like Molly, the amount of money being spent on temporary accommodation for all local authorities in London is blistering. It's eye-watering.
It's balmy, isn't it? It's absolutely balmy.
And so whether there can be a more coordinated and concerted effort across all local authorities, so that there isn't a sort of undermining of the borough next to you, because people can move, they can live anywhere. If you know, Islington may or Lambeth may have a responsibility to house you, but you may end up living anywhere in London, and whether we can have a more coordinated way of coordinating that, where people are placed in temporary accommodation, and how that is being incentivised to the private rented landlord. We need to reduce the number of people joining the queue and speed up the people getting out of that group. I think there are some innovative ways of looking at that. How we can extract groups of people from the whole. That what the link with rough sleeping, I don't know, because as we said, people have a trajectory into rough sleeping quite often. So also continue to invest in pan-London rough sleeping initiatives. We have to have a coordinated effort across all boroughs. At the moment, we have come to the end of the SHAP, Single Homeless Accommodation Programme funding from government. Now, that's been quite a difficult programme to implement in London because of property price, but it is possible. My own organisation have successfully brought online 12 units through that programme. At the moment, there isn't another programme on the horizon, but I would ask the Mayor to campaign for more SHAP funding, which will buy more property in perpetuity, for homes in perpetuity for people who've been sleeping rough.
Okay. And just quickly to come to you, Michelle, we've heard evidence that part of the rise in rough sleeping amongst young people is due to evictions from supported accommodation. What's causing these evictions? Firstly, is that correct? And secondly, what is causing these evictions? Do you know?
I think there's a mix. I think in some cases it's what we've talked about already, the affordability, the gap between people's income and rents, and just slowly getting into debt or arrears, and people either walking out or being asked to leave. I think even supported housing providers and social landlords, they can't forever just sort of, allow people to get into arrears and debt. It'll start to bite at some point. But I think within the exempt supported housing sector, which is probably used by a lot of young people without high support needs, where there's a shortage of commission-supported housing in boroughs, linked to that point I made earlier about the loss of supporting people funding and a shortage of supported housing and sort of low threshold, low support housing in the market. I think the changes in the exempt sector are driving some of that homelessness, as landlords are choosing to exit the sector because they can no longer, frankly, they can no longer milk the system in the way that they were before. So I think that some of those landlords are exiting the system, and that's probably to be welcomed. But that does create a sort of a shortage of suitable accommodation, which needs to be addressed. And I think one thing the Mayor could do in that space, the Mayor does have a convening role and also lots of data, and London is a very fragmented city. And I think that the data that London has is sort of the envy of lots of other cities, not just in England but around the world. But I think that we could do more around things like looking at gaps in service, looking at the distribution of supported housing across the capital. Doing some local authorities by definition are very locally focused, and I think what the Mayor can bring is that sort of city-wide focus on the problem, on the needs, particularly for marginalised groups, where in each individual local authority the numbers present are quite small for women or refugees or LGBT people or whatever it is. And I think the Mayor at that city level could do some of that work and has around things like the Youth Hub to try and meet some of that specialist supported housing needs at a sort of city level.
Okay, thank you. Yasmin, you want to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to come in on those 2 points very quickly. One on, in terms of initiatives that could be worth looking at pan-London. In our Brent service, we deliver the single homelessness prevention service, and that's specifically for people who have been granted asylum. And so our Skylight works with people who have at least 20 days before they are evicted, and it has had a very successful turnaround. So we've supported 233 refugees in the last year, and over half of them have been able to secure stable housing. One of the key things has been working with the council on that, and the use of discretionary housing payments and how that's been used to secure tenancies to cover rent in advance and deposits. And so I would encourage kind of the Mayor looking at a pan-London approach to some of those kind of initiatives that are working well, and also as well as working with national government on welfare changes, also things like discretionary housing payments, which can be more flexibly applied in these kind of scenarios. And then the second point was just on the exempt accommodation sector. Our services are also reporting across London essentially a pause in referrals to some of long-standing supported accommodation providers. And we believe this is coming from a variety of factors, but one of which is there's currently a policy vacuum. So regulation was passed last year, I think it was actually this year, but none of that regulation, so it was the Supported Housing Regulatory Oversight Act, it hasn't actually come into force because the government had said it would have to consult on the measures before that happened. And so at the moment there's a lack of guidance for local authorities around how some of those powers might come in, and we're hearing mixed messages of local authorities looking to review some of their supported accommodation and therefore pausing referrals and pausing the housing benefit while they do so. But while some of this is undoubtedly malpractice, as Michelle has highlighted, some of this has been with long-standing providers that they've been working with for over 10 years, do provide a high quality service. And so we're urging for there to be interim guidance while consultation is still awaiting on how those laws will be implemented. And we'd encourage the Mayor to work with national government, as it is quite a pressing issue in London, and we are concerned that there will be a rise in rough sleeping happening as a result of kind of some reaction from local authorities, and there is a gap in information and guidance around that currently.
Okay, thank you. After the meeting, I'll come and speak to you specifically about that. Alexia.
Just very quickly, you asked the question specifically about eviction from supported accommodation.
Yes.
Supported accommodation rents are very high. They are high. They're made up of support of core rent and quite high service costs. That means that, as Michelle said, when somebody starts to get into arrears, those arrears escalate very, very quickly. People start to get into arrears, young people start to get into arrears when they go through a transition in life. So they may want to take up a job, they take up a job, they can't afford the rent because their salary is very low. The use of discretionary housing payments can be used to make up that shortfall. It's not widespread, but where it is the practice of a local authority, it works well in helping a young person make a transition out of supported accommodation to independent in a planned way and without arrears that will hold them back in trying to get a tenancy in the future.
Simone?
Firstly, let me apologise for being late. Just to pick up on your point, Alexia, about the evictions from supported accommodation, I think what we're seeing in Shelter London is whilst discretionary housing payments are discretionary, how local authorities are applying that changes from borough to borough. And I suppose I'd just like to kind of support your points, Molly, around having a universal system across London and one standard. I think this two-tiered system that we're seeing is causing a lot of vulnerable people to fall through the gaps, namely people with no recourse to public funds, people who have recently acquired status, also are not familiar with the systems and often experience street homelessness. In Shelter London, we have seen a 35% increase in rough sleepers. Traditionally, Shelter isn't an organisation that would focus on rough sleepers, but we are having to address this need, and you know, in terms of resolutions and finding affordable properties, it's taking increasingly an increasing amount of time for caseworkers to resolve these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you indicate, Molly?
Just very briefly, we can look at what's happening in Birmingham at the minute as a bit of a warning around this. So the eviction from supported accommodation has just become their highest reason for homelessness across the city, and you know, they've got a well documented history of challenges in terms of use of exempt accommodation, proliferation of that market, and there's now a lot of work going on to dismantle it. As well-meaning as it is, it's having a significant impact on increasing rates of homelessness from supported accommodation. So I kind of echo the concerns and recommendations from colleagues for that to be a focus.
Thank you, Molly. Chair?
Michelle, did you want to quickly come in before we move on?
Just briefly, on DHP, it's one of the genuinely preventative funding streams that governments give to local authorities. You know, the idea that you can intervene before someone's losing their tenancy, getting in debt and paying a top-up on their rent shortfall. But that too, in the same way that local authorities have lost funding in all sorts of other spheres, DHP has not kept up with inflation. We're sort of at 10 years ago levels of DHP in terms of that funding, and I think it's a priority for a government to invest in that as a truly preventative tool. And at the moment it's probably used more for families than for singles, and it's understandably so, because the costs of TA for local authorities are something like £4 million a day, I think London is spending on TA. So you can understand why local authorities want to prioritise that for families, to prevent family homelessness. But for single people, it can really make a difference when someone transitions into work, like a young person, to have access to a bit of a top-up on the rent while they establish themselves in work and start earning. And it's such a shame that we don't have more of that at our disposal, because it's a very useful tool.
Thank you very much. Before I move on to the next question, Simone, I think we're going to check if your microphone is a bit crackly. It wasn't the last response, but do you mind pulling it forward and just dropping the... Very close. And then if you just push... Hello? Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. I would like to move... Oh, and actually, I thought it might be helpful to put the first question to you. Maybe you might want to respond on, from Shelter's perspective, on what your views are on the main causes of rough sleeping in London, and your views on why there's been a rise, and then we'll go back to the normal cycle of questions.
Yeah, so in Shelter, I think we began to see the rise in street homelessness shortly after COVID, and cohorts, as I mentioned earlier, that seem to be affected the most are those with no recourse to public funds, communities where migrant communities, so people of colour. And also, interestingly, what we're seeing is a rise in the number of women, single women, that are coming to the service and looking for support. The main kind of reasons that people are approaching, or reasons for homelessness, tend to be around the end of NAS accommodation, and support not being there for them to transition into either the private sector or making an approach to a local authority. With women, we often hear the reasons being affordability and relationship breakdown. Fleeing domestic abuse is a big one. I think particularly, as you mentioned, Michelle, single people don't necessarily get the same support from local authorities as families in terms of relieving the immediate homelessness. So these are some of the kind of drivers that we've seen and identified, and again the main one being affordability in London. Working people that are in work are struggling basically to make ends meet, and are losing their tenancies because of that. Quite recently, we've started to monitor a trend where we're seeing over 65s also approach, mainly being at risk of homelessness because of their age. We know that there is a safety net for them in terms of social services and the housing department, but again, it's just a worrying trend, particularly for those households that have worked and expected some security in later life.
Thank you very much, Simone. Assembly Member Cooper.
Thanks very much, Chair. It's been quite a sobering outset of this meeting, but I think we always expected that, and particularly the news from Birmingham, because we looked at exempt accommodation in Birmingham, so I don't really like to hear that canary is in that particular goldmine. That's not good to hear at all. But I just want to come back to the issue of statistics and accuracy of data, which you've all been sort of touching on at various points. Is there anything that we can do to improve the accuracy of the data that we have about who is rough sleeping? Because it's obviously really important if we're making the arguments about how to improve service provision and removing people from rough sleeping beyond, what we get at the moment in the autumn snapshot on the chain statistics. Is there anything that we can do to improve? I'm going to come back to you, Simone, because you were just contributing. What do you think?
I think prevention and early identification is the key. Often what we're finding with our rough sleeping communities or people that are street homeless is that they're not bedding down in one place, so they're often moving from local authority to local authority. So it is quite difficult, I believe, to capture a truly accurate picture of the numbers of people that are roofless. I think, again, a pan-London approach, really having limited but extensive front doors, and again, reliance and funding for the third sector, and for my colleagues that are on the panel that are specialists in this area. I think that would go a long way towards resolving, or at least reducing, the numbers of people that are experiencing street homelessness.
It's quite an important point, the one you make about people moving around, because whilst politicians are very good on boundaries between boroughs and wards and all the rest of it, because we represent, obviously a lot of people, if you talk to them down the street, wouldn't know where one borough starts and another borough begins, and of course they might then lose their local connection. So do you think having that information about the fact that people are moving leads very much into a pan-London approach then, rather than saying, well, we can't help you anymore because you moved from one side of the street literally to the other?
Absolutely. Most of our advocacy work tends to be I suppose being the advocate between local authorities about who is going to resume responsibility for a person and where a duty lies. And whilst these conversations are usually taking place, that person is still ruthless, or organisations such as Shelter and other charities are providing emergency accommodation. Budgets are tight for everybody, including obviously local government. So I think a pan-London approach and the removal of the local connection criteria when it comes to rough sleepers would help, alleviate some of these issues and reduce the scale of the problem.
I'm just going to bring in Jasmine now to get the point of view of crisis, and then I just want to see what Michelle feels about this very thorny issue, because you're obviously here representing London councils, and obviously it is an issue about this, local connection. Jasmine, do you want to just comment on stats, figures, and how more information would help us prevent?
Yeah, thank you. Obviously, as you've mentioned, I think it's been said, the chain data that London holds is amongst the best, certainly the best nationally and amongst the best in the world. But one of the things that we're doing in Brent is an approach by a team called Built for Zero, and this is an approach that's been adopted from the United States, and it is a data-driven, localised, community-based approach. And what we're seeing is there's a gap between recorded data in chain because it doesn't include non-statutory services and community services perhaps as well as it could. So we have been pulling information from a wider pool of information and working with a broader range of services. And for example, we were able to add a cohort of people sleeping rough to our data from a outreach team that weren't previously recognised. And so if we look at the data that we collected in Brent over the period of October 2023 to June 2024 of people sleeping rough in the borough and compared it with chain data, we actually found we had a 24% increase in the numbers of people, and largely that is accounting for people who aren't being picked up by statutory services and people with no recourse to public funds. So we think there are ways of improving and building on the chain database, working with the community. The other area just to pull out as well is for women sleeping rough, and you might be aware of the work of Solace Women's Aid and the Single Homeless Project around a women's rough sleeping census, and they've really focused in on the fact that often women will be transient, so the annual snapshot will not definitely undercounts women because often they will sort of sleep in more hidden places like A&E or walk around all night, so then they're not in one place and feeling at risk and in danger. And so there's some recommendations, and actually in Brent, the Built for Zero team has adopted the women's census recommendations, and that includes allowing outreach teams and local kind of community information to verify women that are sleeping rough. And so you're looking at those other community-based sources who are in touch with people to actually add into the data collection. But I think particularly the recommendation around the women's census is a really powerful one to consider.
Thank you. Michelle, some difficult issues here for local authorities because of the way that we all operate with these boundaries. How would you respond either on the points about improving the data, but also the sort of the outreach, the early contact, dealing with people who are, not really noticing where one borough ends and another one starts?
I mean, I think what's good in the last few years is that the Mayor, GLA and the boroughs have collaborated really well on the data side of things and on looking at whether services should be better delivered at a sort of borough level, a sub-regional level or a pan-London level. So we've done quite a lot of thinking around that, and more of our service in the rough sleeping space now are delivered either at a pan-London level or sub-regionally, recognising the fact that not only does that give you economies of scale, but that this is a very mobile group and often specialist sort of cohorts, horrible word, but within rough sleeping, each borough can't possibly meet the needs of each, all the very many different groups of people there are. So I think within London there's been a real growth of sub-regional and pan-London services over the last few years, and I think that's welcomed by local authorities. Because
Do you think we need more?
I think so. I think it all needs to be looked at. I think the problem is the funding. So the form follows function, in the sense that funding is given to local authorities and it's based on the number of rough sleepers that were counted, I don't know, 3 years ago or something like that. So the funding that we're given is a programme funding for rough sleepers based on a count in a borough, and it doesn't lend itself to sub-regional or pan-London working necessarily. And I think if we can make the case in London working in the way we have been, that these services should sit at this level and these services should be London level, and these services are best delivered at a borough level, I think that we can help government to put the funding in the right places within the city. So that is work that we are doing at the moment.
But it sounds as though we still need more up-to-date data, and Jasmine has just been describing a gap between the chain data and what they were able to uncover in Brent by further outreach work being done in communities.
Yeah, I mean,
how do we address that?
I mean, to be fair on that point, London Councils was a huge collaborator and driver of the Women's Census when it was developed 3 years ago. Every London local authority participated in the Women's Census that happened a few weeks ago. We really firmly believe that the system of bedded down counting and verifying and waiting for someone to lie down on the street before they count as a rough sleeper is not helpful to us. And a lot of London boroughs are moving towards an intelligence-led approach, such as the type that the census offers, where you bring people together and you don't just think about the people you see, but you think about all the people you don't see. We learnt from the Women's Census, which all local authorities collaborated on and embraced. We're doing the same with the Young Person Census, and we are talking to West Midlands and Greater Manchester about whether there's merits in doing that for non-UK or NRPF rough sleepers who are similarly hidden, because it's not safe to sleep out in the open. So our view is that counting, the sort of bedded down verification obsession that we have about rough sleeping, it masks a lot of problems underneath. So we say 10,000 people sleep rough in a year, but not everybody's created equal. What that hides is deep inequality for some groups. Some people spend 3 hours on the street and are never seen again, and some people are living on the street with very complex needs. And I think we've got good services in London, again, where we've collaborated well. The Target Priority Group, for example, 1,000 of London's most complex rough sleepers who move around a lot are given a sort of dedicated caseworking offer that is blind to geographical boundaries, follows them wherever they go within the city. And working with the GLA-funded team, we've made quite good progress to get 70% of that group indoors. We've got a long way to go. Local connection is, of course, a problem for this group and other groups because of the mobility. But we are not applying it in the same way to rough sleepers as we do within statutory legislation. It is much more flexible. We are doing the best we can with very limited resources.
Thank you. Molly, I can see that you want to come in and answer this, but I've also got another question that I also want to put to you. So if I can ask you to comment on what we were just talking about, but also it's to sort of what happened during COVID and the Everybody In initiative. There must be some lessons from that. Do you feel that we've really learnt the lessons? Because we did actually manage to get everybody in, although it has so massively reversed. I mean, I've got several people who are sleeping rough in various parts of my constituency who I see on a regular basis. They are, they're back now. They weren't there during COVID. Can what we did during COVID be applied to our current strategies to help us reduce rough sleeping back down again now that we are, well, actually there seems to be quite a lot of COVID around, so perhaps I'm not going to say post-pandemic, but, in this post that sort of period when we really made such an effort.
Yeah, I'll come to the previous question first, and as you will know, the Centre for Homelessness Impact exists to improve the use of data and evidence in work to end homelessness. So the questions around the data we have are especially pertinent to the work that we do. And I think it's worth sort of just breaking it down into 2 points. And one is what data we collect and how. And I think broadly that's quite good. Chain, as others have said, is quite a high of quite high standard to many other areas. But what it does lack is that in more intelligence-led, bringing in third sector insights and making sure that we're really kind of taking a proactive view of understanding the number of people that are sleeping rough in their experiences who are more likely to be hidden. But the second stage to that is how we use it. And I think we're currently using data, especially Chain, as a very blunt tool to design and deliver services in a way that it probably isn't intended or best used to do. We also see that because verification is and counting is such a central kind of part of our data approach, that it also is then driving the delivery of outreach services, and that a lot of outreach services spend a lot of time going and finding people who have been reported and having a conversation with them so that they can be verified. And actually what we need to be doing more is that insight piece, is that analysis piece of what is this telling us about what's happening, what isn't it telling us about what's happening, and what's it saying about what works, and what other evidence do we need. And I think that second stage, which is again coming back to that kind of governance, coordination, convening point, is where London can do a lot better. We've got really high numbers of people who are new to rough sleeping, really quite high numbers of people who are recurring rough sleepers. Those two groups make up 50% of everybody that's rough sleeping in London. Work to prevent rough sleeping and prevent it from being a repeat experience happens outside of street outreach, but we're not looking at what the data says there about what we can do differently. And at the centre, we think that there's interventions that need to be tested in order to give the evidence needed to really have an impact there. And, you know, as others have said, there's good collaboration when it comes to response and recovery. There's obviously capacity issues and other challenges, but we're not yet, from a data and evidence perspective, really thinking about prevention and really thinking about how we stop people returning to rough sleeping, especially when they've been placed in settled accommodation. That was the point on evidence and data that I wanted to make. On COVID and on everyone in, yes, there were obviously huge gains there, and I think some of the unique factors of health being a core driving perspective on this is something that we can definitely learn from. Homelessness and rough sleeping as a health emergency was a key enabler of the Everyone In response, and there's no reason that it shouldn't still be a core enabler and key foundation for driving and accelerating work to end rough sleeping. On an ongoing basis. Rough sleeping is a health emergency. There is significant damaging impacts of health for even one night spent rough sleeping, let alone multiple, and that is well evidenced. I think some of the other conditions, such as really kind of high levels of practical collaboration and coordination around very clear goals. You know, Everyone In is a very clear goal to work towards. You know, that the goals that we pick for ending rough sleeping more sustainably might look differently. The centre speaks through the definition of preventing rough sleeping, making sure it's rare, making sure it's brief, and making sure it's non-recurring. Working towards those 4 goals in a really targeted way is something that could be adopted and to some extent has been, but needs kind of more collaboration, coordination around. And then, I mean, the other thing that we saw and that's been commented on a lot, especially by frontline and voluntary organisations, is just the kind of the permission to go out and do what makes sense to do. And we weren't held back quite so much by some of the policies, procedures, the verifications, the assessment levels that we impose in day-to-day work, because, you know, it was seen that actually there's this other thing that's far more important, and we're going to take the fastest route there. So I think some of the kind of process challenges and within the system can be
can be lifted, can be moved through much quicker if there is will to do so. I think that's one of the things that everyone in showed, and where there's room for opportunity of saying now, okay, well, where those barriers have gone back up, where those procedural challenges have come back up, and organisations have stopped working together as they did during that time, how do we unpick
how do we get back there?
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone want to add to what Molly has just been saying about everyone in? Did you want to come in on that, Jasmine? And then I can see Michelle just waved as well. Jasmine.
Thank you. Completely agree with everything the points Molly has made. Just a couple of additional, which are quite obvious, I think, and won't be news. But the most significant kind of intervention was the flexibility of everyone in, and including supporting people with no recourse to public funds. We know that did obviously there were concerns around local authorities because they still knew that the offer would be limited. They could support people into emergency accommodation but not really provide much more wraparound support because of the restrictions around that. But even that first step was really integral, and it's something we also see when we are delivering our kind of services over winter, where we have specialist services around that, and actually where we can work with people with no recourse for 2 to 3 months, where they are safely accommodated. It makes a really significant difference in their ability to engage in services, and for us to work with specialist immigration or legal services to try to resolve some of the reasons why they are still homeless. And in addition to that, it is that wider point on the health element, bringing people inside and actually giving space where they can rest, recuperate, then allowed for people to have the capacity to genuinely engage in services. And I think this is a point that's sometimes missed in kind of the approach to homelessness in general, is this expectation that people can just engage straight away. But actually there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of difficulty and particular danger with rough sleeping. And so we saw in the areas we were supporting, it would often take 1 or 2 weeks where people just slept and rested, and then they were able to engage. And so that thinking of where we do have provision and where we're providing kind of self-contained accommodation to people, how do we provide that wraparound support in a way that meets their needs is really important. And then one of the other things that in our research came through quite clearly was there was a myriad of pauses and changes around welfare, which had a significant impact, of course, in the pandemic, and the ability to do kind of prevention activity. But one of the other things was moving from choice-based allocations to direct lets. And in some parts of the country, we saw kind of panels set up around allocations that were made up of organisations, so local homelessness organisations and housing associations, and it meant there were more direct lets to people who were homeless into social housing where that was available. But kind of exploring some of the models around that were particularly innovative, and there might be some learnings there that are quite interesting.
Yeah, I used to work for an organisation that ran direct access facilities and met guests who'd just arrived, and that is so true that people quite often need a couple of weeks just to, get their head back in a space where they can start to think about the future, actually. I'm going to bring in Michelle, and I can also see that Alexia wants to come in as well. Michelle.
I'll be quick, thank you. I mean, I think there were 3 quick lessons from everyone in for me, in addition to what colleagues have already said. One is obvious. It's really easy to help people when you know where they are, when you're not looking for them, when they're not outside, they're in a building, when you have an appointment, they're there. The second thing is there are lots more people that are in housing crisis, single people in London than we thought. Your point about data, 1,000 people are thought to be sleeping rough on any given night in London, according to the stats. I think we housed 7,000 people during everyone in, so where were the other 6,000? There were people whose housing need was very desperate, they were very hidden, they weren't in the official stats. And I think that sort of no conditions offer that everyone in meant that you could help a lot of those people, and we've just stopped being able to do that. And there's a chasm between statutory homelessness and rough sleeping, and that chasm, there's no services, there's no offer. Single people are faced with a choice of being in chronic housing need or sleeping rough to try and get help, and I think that's a terrible thing. And I think the third thing that's also very terrible is that at the end of everyone in, there was a cohort of people, I probably could tell you exactly where they are, in how many numbers and in which borough, who after 2 or 3 years of everyone in were returned to the streets because of their no recourse to public funds designation, and that is destitution by design. And those people are now sleeping rough and will be until the next time there's a pandemic or something, and that is a very shocking, a very bad thing. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to have to ask you to be quick, Alexia, because I know the chair is going to slap my wrist if we're not.
Yep. There is one vestige of everyone in left, the Pan London Youth Hub, 26 units based in Islington, 200 young people who've slept rough have gone through that service. It has an 86% positive planned move-on rate, and it was designed, the financial modelling was designed to be able to take people who had no recourse, who were coming out of asylum seeker accommodation with no ID, etc., and be able to work with that group and try and move them on. So that's just one little example of, and that is one of the RSI funded services that is at risk next March. Right. On the data, the youth census, we did this, I spoke earlier of the dip test we did with 3 boroughs. We're hoping to roll that out in the spring across the whole of London, all 33 boroughs, in the same way the youth census, the women's census was undertaken. But our dip test showed that of the 40 people we did meet and the questionnaire interviewed, 28% were not on chain. So like with the women's cohort, right, we know there's a hidden cohort there.
Similar to the figures that Jasmine was saying. Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much also to the panel.
Thank you very much. And I have visited that centre in Islington, and they really do amazing work. Can I move on to Assembly Member Garbutt, please?
Thank you. And just a huge thanks to all of you for your contributions today, but all the work you do within this really complex and broken system that we've got. We are running really short on time, so I'm going to be really specific on my question. So, Michelle, I know you've mentioned a number of ways that the Mayor could support local authorities, things like working together and looking at landlord behaviour and, you know, the loss of kind of tenancy support and welfare support and things. But I just wondered if there's anything else you think the Mayor could be doing specifically to support local authorities.
I think in this space we work very well with the Mayor. We have the Life Off the Streets board, we convene it collectively, and we collaborate super well. I think there's more that could be done around the market, perhaps the private rented sector, market management, and sort of trying to join up some of the procurement we do, or some of the standards issues around the private rented sector, possibly. We do collaborate as London boroughs to try and manage the market together, but I think the Mayor could assist in that place, and particularly with lobbying around government departments. We're not just competing with each other for scarce private rented sector tenancies in London, we're competing with the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice, the MOD, the NHS. So it's a sort of very fragmented and kind of messy market situation. I think I've mentioned already something about the sort of needs assessment, the strategic needs assessment. You know, the Mayor's got the Strategic Migration Partnership, sort of a central role around health equality within London. I think there's something there, bringing some of that expertise and understanding to bear on understanding the rough sleeping picture more widely. And I think there'll always be a need for some Pan-London services that will need to be delivered at that Pan-London level, which we're very well supported with, things like chain we've talked about, but there may well be other things that make sense at a Pan-London level. One thing we've been looking at is people who return to rough sleeping. Your point, Molly, we have 2,000 people a year who've left rough sleeping, and we've housed them in some way, and they return, and that kind of a service or some intervention or some work in that space can only really make sense at a Pan-London level, because people are so mobile and they get resettled out of area. So I think there's probably something in that, what we call returners, you know, that sort of preventing people from returning when they've left the streets, that we probably need to scope out together. But yeah, and the data we've talked about, just really using the data and intelligence to inform commissioning, to inform problem solving at a system level.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the Pan-London point comes across really strongly in a lot of your responses. I was working in the NHS as a commissioner during the everyone in pandemic part, and just the disparity and just difference in how people were approaching it. And I think all those lessons learnt around kind of doing things once and in a consistent way is really strong from the panel. Just as a quick follow-up, is there anything you think the Mayor could be doing specifically in the area of exempt accommodation? Just quickly.
I think London Councils is doing some work in that space at the moment, sort of surveying local authorities, meeting providers and trying to get a sense of what's happening, what housing benefit teams across London are doing in that space. It's a concern to us as it is to a lot of the providers. Because it's something that's situated with local authorities, it's something that is being led by London Councils, but we are looking to do more with the Mayor around wider forms of homelessness, and we would certainly share those findings with the Mayor and be interested in having conversations about it on a London level.
Great, thank you. I know we're short on time and others want to come in, so thank you.
Okay. Assembly Member Small-Edwards, please.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. My follow-up is just to Michelle, and kind of wanted to know what support has been lacking from national government to local authorities in recent years as the problems Rough sleeping has exacerbated, and what you'd want to see from the new government in terms of support to local authorities.
Thank you. I mean, I think I started off by saying that rough sleeping is it's system failure, isn't it, really? It's the very sharp end of homelessness. But if the market wasn't so much in crisis, and if we didn't have such a wider homelessness crisis, we would have much smaller numbers of rough sleeping and it would be a more manageable problem. So the main thing we need is restoration of funding that was lost to us in order to be able to do meaningful homelessness prevention, for us to be able to offer something not just to families, which is a TA placement, but to prevent that form of homelessness, to not have to spend £4 million a day on temporary accommodation, and it would liberate us to do more for single people. I say £4 million a day, £1.6 billion spent on homelessness by local authorities last year. If you say it often enough, it stops sounding like anything. But it's a massive funding crisis for local authorities, and it is sucking all of the resource that really should be spent on homelessness prevention, on preventing people coming out of prison and going to the streets, preventing people from losing their PRS tenancy, preventing people from getting into debt, supporting them with those kind of issues. It's just not possible for us to do that within the resource constraints that we've got at the moment. So I hate to say it, but fundamentally it's about restoring funding that's been lost over the last 14 years. Yeah.
And obviously some local authorities are at the sharp end of this more than others, particularly, say, Westminster in my constituency is obviously a high level of concentration. How can these areas with high numbers of rough sleepers be more adequately supported?
I think as well as funding, we've talked about the whole system approach, about making sure there's some parity of access to provision across the capital. I think why Westminster has a lot of rough sleeping is partly because it's Westminster, but partly because there's a proliferation of services in that area that people are attracted to and people need. And I think if we had more equity around the way services were distributed, if we could do more in people's home boroughs to prevent the rough sleeping at source, they wouldn't travel into the city where they're at risk of exploitation and violence and things like that. So I think it does all come back to that point that there is a moment, usually, when you can intervene with someone. Not everybody, not all the time. Sometimes crises happen, but a lot of rough sleeping is preventable. If you get in early enough, when someone's in there, whether they're on a couch, whether they're in a tenancy, whether they're in the family home, if good housing advice, good debt advice, good tenancy support, good tenancy rescue services are available in your locality, you don't need to go to Westminster or Camden or those kind of places to sleep rough. And I think that's what's lacking in the system at the moment.
Yeah, I think, Westminster's a key consideration in this, given the numbers across London as a whole. Last year, over 2,000 people slept rough in Westminster, which is more than twice as high as the second closest borough. And I think what we know is that people they don't come to Westminster, they come to London. And they end up in Westminster because it's the centre, it's the hub, there's a proliferation of services and other things. So this really speaks to the need for pan-London collaboration. It's simply, doesn't make sense that one borough should be expected to deal with rough sleeping on that scale and take, sole ownership within their council services for those individuals. And as we know, it simply, doesn't result in being able to prevent and relieve rough sleeping at scale. But there are some really good, as Michelle said, good services in that space, one of which in a prevention space is the No Night Out work that the Passage do in collaboration with the City Council. This is one of the few genuine prevention-based rough sleeping services, which is immediate or very quick kind of housing, rehousing support, either into private rented sector or reconnection elsewhere. Lots of people receive that and settle outside of London or across London. And so what I want to highlight is that we need to know more about what works when it comes to prevention, but also when we find those things, we need to not just put those in the areas of highest concentration, we need to put those more broadly, because as we say, people travel and people come to different parts of London for different reasons. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you very much. Maybe bring Simone.
Thank you. I made a point earlier about the cohort of rough sleepers that are coming to Shelter London, I would say in the last year or so, that are those with newly acquired status and are just evicted from NAS accommodation with very little kind of advice or support about how to navigate systems. And I do think there is a role for the Mayor here to kind of negotiate, I suppose, with the Home Office about the way that they do end their accommodation and the support that is provided to those that are being evicted, because many of those people are ending up on the streets.
Thank you. And to follow up and potentially bring you in again, Simone, what impact have mayoral programmes such as Life Off the Streets and the Rough Sleeping Plan of Action had on rough sleeping in London?
I wouldn't say that I would be the best person to comment on that, but I think these initiatives are very useful, but they need to be scaled a bit more. And as Michelle mentioned, I think investment and extra funding is something that's needed.
Michelle, would you want to comment on those programmes?
I think, it's hard, isn't it, because rough sleeping is going up, but I think the operating environment is so hostile that I feel really proud of the Life Off the Streets programme and the services that are there, and I can see that they're working. Collectively, we're housing hundreds of people every month. Some of the services around the sub-regional immigration advice, for example, they are groundbreaking. Like Molly said, government's taking it up as an example of a test and learn project because no one had thought to do that. We have immigration advice, housing and support in every London borough for people who have uncertain immigration status, and that's incredible. But it's like trying to empty a bath with the taps running, if I can use that analogy. As good as the work is, and as much as we're housing people, and as much as the activities under that programme, the Mayor working closely with boroughs to deliver those services, the numbers are going up because we cannot just turn the tap off because of the market conditions and the new rough sleeping, and 2,000 people a quarter new to rough sleeping every quarter in London. So it's as fast as we're doing good work, until we address that upstream need to prevent new people coming onto the streets, we won't succeed. But I think within the programme, incredible collaboration with other government departments. We've got MOJ there, Home Office there. We've got meetings we have with DWP, with the GLA and London councils collaboratively. So we're trying across all the areas. It's just that challenge of new flow, which is making it very difficult.
Thank you. And finally, just to Jasmine and Molly, is there any best practice from other cities on rough sleeping that we could potentially adopt in London?
I think one of the kind of, on a kind of greater mayoral level, we're very interested in the work that Andy Burnham is doing in Greater Manchester. I would caveat that's not completely focused on rough sleeping, but as we've heard today, I think there's a really important point with early prevention and some of the drivers of this. The levers are very much the bigger picture around welfare and housing supply. And so we would really love to see the Mayor and kind of any approach to rough sleeping in London and beyond take into account that bigger picture. And what Andy Burnham is, or what's happening in the Greater Manchester Combined Authority area, is looking at how they actually tackle the supply of genuinely affordable homes, but also take actions to drive up standards in the private rented sector and against kind of rogue landlords, and then also look at kind of the wraparound support that residents get around education, skills and training, health and well-being. And I think at the moment he's coordinating this through something called a new Housing First unit. So that's not Housing First on a programmatic level, which we are very supportive of and would love to see a more pan-London approach of that. But that is very much a programme for people with very high complex needs who have long histories of homelessness. And what Andy Burnham and the Greater Manchester Combined Authority is doing is looking at how, across the board, how are you increasing the supply of genuinely affordable housing so you can more quickly support people into housing with wraparound support, which is based on the principles of Housing First. So we think there's something really interesting there that could be looked at, and some kind of parts of that applicable to London as well.
Yeah, apologies. Also from Greater Manchester, which is my previous area of work. So first would be on prisons work, so preventing rough sleeping from people who are leaving custody. Greater Manchester using kind of devolution and an alignment of the probation footprint to the region have the best outcomes when it comes to people leaving prison and preventing homelessness. There's some fantastic work there that I think we could learn from in London. And then the second thing is the Street Engagement Hub that they have developed, which is a really strong collaboration between the local authorities, the police and the third sector. And this hits on that intersection between begging, street activity and rough sleeping that in London is a real challenge, and I think, you know, often leads us into spaces where we've got misconceptions about what's happening or what the risks are, and some of our policy making is therefore more reactive or not completely evidence-based. So I would recommend the panel to look at the Street Engagement Hub work in Greater Manchester.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I think we do have time. Assembly Member Turrell, do you want to put your question briefly?
Yeah, if I just quickly jump in, just point this one to Michelle, please. Which is from a London Council's perspective, what policy changes do you think need to be implemented nationally or regionally for the Mayor to meet his commitment of ending rough sleeping by 2030?
Thank you. I think fundamentally we've talked a lot about that there's just not enough affordable housing of all types in London. So I think the biggest driver of that in recent years has been LHA rates, local housing allowance rates, and their failure to keep up with increases in rents, to the effect that so much of the private rented sector is unaffordable for families and for single people and for under 35s, for everyone. So I think reverses to the sort of freezing of local housing allowances is fairly critical in terms of trying to address that affordability gap. I think within that there are other welfare policies we've heard from panellists today that are also impacting on affordability and people's ability both to sustain tenancies they've got now and to access new tenancies. So we've talked about the shared accommodation rate, issues about the benefit cap and other policies in that space. Fundamentally, we need more houses, obviously, which the Mayor and government collectively are seeking to address. We have such a shortage in London, but it's not just about housing supply, it's also, I think, about how we use the stock we have. So we do have a lot of voids, we do have more evictions than we need, we do have allocations issues with perhaps the right people not getting the tenancies, and we're not really making use of the stock we have to reduce TA numbers. So I think there is some work that could be done beyond building new homes, but just to look at how we make best use of the stock we have and sweat the assets we have and make sure we're using every unit we have. So I think it's in that space mostly where a contribution from central government would help. Yeah.
Thank you. Back to you.
Okay, thank you. So if you would like to respond to that question, I apologise that we're over time, but it would be really grateful if you wouldn't mind writing into us to let us know, because I think that would be really helpful for us making recommendations as a committee. And the other thing I wanted to ask, the Housing Committee, along with I think some members of the Police and Crime Committee, will be visiting HMP Bronzefield this month. And we don't have a call for evidence for that one-off visit, but many of you have mentioned prisons and women in particular. And so if you have thoughts that you're able to share with us, that again would be really, really helpful to kind of inform our thinking and see what comes out of that particular piece of work. So thank you very much. It's been really, really fascinating, if not sobering. But I want to thank you for your contributions for the day. And we will now adjourn for 10 minutes. Let's go with 10. So thank you, everybody. begin. Welcome back to the London Assembly's Housing Committee, and welcome to our second panel of guests. It's nice to see you all. We'll be discussing rough sleeping in London today. And we have David Eastwood, who's lead manager for rough sleeping at the Greater London Authority, Tom Copley, Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development, and Megan Life, Head of Specialist Housing and Services at the GLA as well. So I will take the first question and then, as ever, hand over to my colleagues. So my first question is to you, Tom. What has driven the 32% rise in rough sleeping in London over the last year, in your opinion?
Thank you, Chair. It's good to be with you to talk about this very important topic. The first thing that I would highlight is the impact of City Hall's services before getting quite into your question. So since 2016, more than 17,600 people have been helped by City Hall services. The vast majority are not seen sleeping rough again. So 97% of people supported by No Second Night Out, for example, are not seen sleeping rough again. And the Mayor has also increased, I think quadrupled, City Hall funding for rough sleeping services from £8.5 million a year to £36.3 million a year. So I just want to emphasise how seriously we take this. There are a few things driving the increase. So over half of those on London streets are migrants. So we know that we can't eradicate rough sleeping without addressing migrant homelessness. And we've seen a big increase in the number of people we are seeing on the streets who have just left asylum accommodation. People leaving asylum accommodation, these are people, by the way, who have been granted asylum. They only get 28 days' notice, and for a period, I think last year, in effect, they were only getting 7 days' notice. Now, with the best will in the world, if English is your first language and you are very, very familiar with, the housing system in this country, even with 28 days' notice, it is very, very hard to navigate and find accommodation at such short notice, which is why we, myself and the Mayor, have been pushing for 56 days' notice. And the really galling thing about this and about the fact that, people leaving asylum accommodation are forming an increasing number of the people on our streets is this is entirely preventable. These aren't people with complex needs. These are people who want to work, but because of the system that is in place, they end up on the streets and therefore needing to be helped by our services. We've also seen an increasing number of young people sleeping rough. So 1 in 10 people sleeping rough now are aged under 26. And this is caused, by various things, including sort of family breakdown and things like that. We have, of course, established the Youth Homelessness Hub, which is helping young people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. And in addition to that, the SHAP programme that we run is also, as well as being targeted at rough sleepers who have complex needs, is also targeted at young rough sleepers. And then, of course, there's the general issue around insecurity in the private renter sector and stuff like that. And what I'm really hoping is that the now named Renters' Rights Bill is passed into law very quickly. I think it's just had its second reading. And that provides more security of tenure for people living in the private renter sector, which is, of course, the most insecure form of tenure that we have. David, Megan, would you like to add anything?
I think you can't underestimate the impact that austerity and cuts to wider services have had in terms of around the impact and the increased number of rough sleepers. Many of the kind of traditional, if you look back 10, 15 years, and I've been in the sector for 15, 20 years, there were services there that would help pick people up before they were rough sleeping and help prevent rough sleeping. As those services got cut, understandably, local authority budgets have got tighter and tighter, it's meant that we are now more at that we've been very much at that crisis solution and have been picking people up rather than preventing people. I think what we need to be doing more of, and what I know we'll probably talk about the plan of action later, but what we need to look more at is around preventing, and more work we can do to provide that prevention work further upstream to help stop people from feeling the need to rough sleep to access services.
I think that's such an important. I just want to add. I think that's such an important point. And although local authorities, have duties under the Homelessness Reduction Act to prevent homelessness, in reality, they just are not resourced to be able to do that. I mean, the committee will be very aware of just how much local authorities are having to spend in terms of their, money and in terms of their time and resources on temporary accommodation. If you're single and homeless and you turn up to a housing options service, in reality, you're not going to be getting the support that you need.
Yeah, and just to build on what David and Tom have said there, I think that really underscores how important wider resolution to the wider homelessness crisis is to ending rough sleeping, and it would be unwise of us to kind of separate those and treat them separately. So we need to be thinking big about how we support boroughs and work with government to resolve the crisis in temporary accommodation and statutory homelessness, as well as what solutions we need to see on rough sleeping specifically.
Thank you very much for that. So I suppose the Mayor calling to move that the time for asylum seekers to 56 days does bring them in line with the Homelessness Reduction Act, but as you say, there is a separate issue around resourcing for local authorities and others to enforce that, but that would be really welcome. So I wanted to ask you, you've mentioned refugees, you've mentioned young people, and one of our previous speakers, Alexia from DePaul, talked about SHAP as something that they were working with you and other partners on, but also mentioned that that was reaching the end of its commissioned period next year. But I just wondered if what additional support the Mayor is providing to those specific groups that are particularly affected. And we also heard a bit about women in the last session.
So we've supported the Women's Rough Sleeping Census, which... who carried that one out, David? Was it St Mungo's?
No, it's carried out with Solace Women's Aid.
Solace, yeah. So they carried that out. And you've mentioned SHAP. We also, of course, ran the RSAP programme, the Rough Sleeping Accommodation programme, in order to provide this move-on accommodation. We're very, very keen to support this kind of supported accommodation through our Affordable Homes programme as well. So we are encouraging delivery partners to think about how they can bring forward more of this accommodation through our kind of, more general affordable homes programme. I think the challenge with it, though, is that there isn't any revenue funding attached to that. And I think that revenue funding is quite key to this kind of accommodation. So that's something that we continue to make the case for if we are going to see, the kind of the bigger expansion of this sort of accommodation. We also, we also, of course, run Clearinghouse, which is provided about 3,500 homes that are provided through housing associations as move-on accommodation for rough sleepers as well.
So in addition to what Tom said there about the importance of revenue funding alongside the kind of capital funding for the units, I just wanted to make the point that we're also starting to think about what a kind of longer-term settlement on supported housing looks like. So trying to move away from the kind of piecemeal programme-by-programme approach that we've had in the past, which, has been helpful to some extent. We'd rather have that than nothing. But in an ideal world, I think we would want long-term certainty on the capital funding for the bricks and mortar, as well as certainty on the revenue money for the support services that sit alongside that.
Did you want?
And just to add in relation to RSAP and SHAP in terms of the revenue side of things, we are strongly lobbying government in terms of around that continued funding to provide the revenue support for those units. We're acutely aware that we have people in those units who still require support. We obviously want to make the most of those units that we spent the capital money on to continue to be used for that purpose. So we are very much lobbying government to achieve that funding.
Okay. This is just me wondering. So there's been talk of an interministerial panel to look at homelessness and rough sleeping across different departments, and not just MHCLG. But obviously here the Deputy Mayor's office, your office is one person and looking solely at that particular issue, the housing area, but we've talked about revenue and capital funding. So I guess I'm just wondering how far progressed you are with those conversations. I appreciate it's only just over 100 days, but whether there are some departments that are more open to taking a more holistic approach to tackling the crisis more fundamentally, and just an idea of what the sum of money might be for revenue and capital.
I can't comment on the sums of money. We don't know about that yet, and obviously everything is kind of pending based on the autumn statement at the moment. I think there is a real opportunity here, now that we have the Deputy Prime Minister as the person responsible for housing and homelessness, because I think, as Deputy Prime Minister, rather than just being, a Secretary of State, she kind of has a bit of license to be cross-cutting and to go into other areas and to really knock some heads together. And I think that's absolutely vital, because particularly in terms of homelessness and rough sleeping, obviously it's not just MHCLG, Treasury is, as ever, always very important, Home Office in terms of immigration, DWP in terms of welfare. So I think that there is a real opportunity for Angela Rayner to corral these other departments into doing the things that we need in order to get us to where we want to be, which is ending homelessness. And of course, she's going to be looking more, we obviously at the GLA are looking at very much at rough sleeping, but in the context of the wider homelessness crisis. I think that the task force that the Deputy Prime Minister is chairing will be looking holistically at homelessness in general, which, as Megan and David have said, is really, really important in terms of cracking rough sleeping specifically.
Just to add from that, I think there have been some really good programmes that have come out prior to this. For example, the CAS3 project, which is a community accommodation service, which is MOJ funded, which provides accommodation post-release for anyone who is likely to end up rough sleeping or at risk of homelessness, and provides up to 12 weeks accommodation. So I think there have been things that we're there to build on, but I think we need to be working with the wider departments to get further commitments from them, and hopefully that will be part of the government's work.
Thank you. Assemblymember Garbutt.
Thanks, and hello, panel. Just to bring us back to young people, so I've been speaking with New Horizon Youth Centre, who provided data that young people, rough sleeping has increased by 33% in the last year, which I think we'd all agree is pretty terrifying. And they put a lot of this crisis down to the evictions from exempt supported accommodation. And we heard in the last panel from London councils that they have started to look at this, but it sounds quite urgent. I just wondered what the Mayor's office was doing to kind of look at centralised guidance and audit or support in this specific instance.
I mean, one of the main ways that we're helping young rough sleepers or people who are at risk of homelessness is through the Youth Homelessness Hub. David, do you have the figure for how many people have been helped?
I think it's well over 200.
Well over 200 people helped by that service, which of course New Horizons runs for us in collaboration with DePaul, and we are very grateful to them for that. The point about exempt accommodation is interesting. I think we'll need to take that back and think about what role we might have in that, or whether or not this is something that's perhaps better led by London councils, big L, big C, to produce some guidance or what might be helpful in terms of this for local authorities.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful to do that collaboration. And then just on the funding for young people, so young people make up, as you were saying, about 10% of the rough sleeping population. I just wondered how the budget that the Mayor has in this area is equivalent to, does it reflect 10% of the budget that goes into youth services? Because there is a lot of evidence that obviously people who have slept rough under the age of 25, it is very likely that they become homeless in the future, and that kind of entrenched homelessness. And there's evidence that it can save an adult pathway up to 1.2 million, that investment in young people.
So I will pass over to David and Megan for this. I think in general, obviously we've got the specific youth service that we fund, but of course young people will be helped by the more general services like No Second Night Out, for example. But I don't know if David or Megan can shed a bit more light on this than me.
Yeah, I mean, I would also add, as well as our services, there are obviously local authority services that will also be providing and set up in terms of to provide for this group. In terms of percentage, I don't know off the top of my head, Zoe, and I'm happy to go away and look at that, and then look also in terms of around, as Tom mentioned, in relation to SHAP, if you know, in the breakdown in terms of around youth services to adults.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. Assembly Member Small-Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. It's been mentioned the additional funding and resources that's been put into homelessness services under this mayor, but I was just wondering how are those resources and funding being allocated to ensure that boroughs are equipped to reduce rough sleeping, and particularly for those boroughs experiencing particularly high need and facing significant increase in challenges in this area, like, say, Westminster in my constituency?
So in terms of the RSI funding, we get an allocation for the GLA from the government, and boroughs themselves will get allocations too. So Westminster, for example, will have its own allocation of RSI from the government. Of course, we fund services that kind of sit pan-London, that all, that sort of, multiple boroughs will benefit from. In particular, of course, No Second Night Out, but also things like our rapid response outreach teams, our tenancy sustainment teams, for example. So, I mean, we might, post the meeting, be able to provide you with a bit more of a breakdown, for example, related to your constituency. I don't know, David, if that's possible.
We can easily break down, and we have done recently in terms of looking at our Pan-London RSI funded services, broken those down by borough and by sub-regions to give, so boroughs and sub-regions can understand the impact that these services have in terms of around for their borough. I mean, we work very closely with Westminster and with Camden. I used to work in Westminster myself many moons ago, but we have, when I have a monthly meeting with them and with MHCLG in terms of around looking at issues that are happening in Westminster and Camden and how can we help. So, for example, recently our Roma Rough Sleeping team have been supporting Westminster's outreach team in terms of around tackling some of the hotspots that they have in the area to provide the appropriate support.
Just to make a couple of general points on local authority provision for rough sleeping services. So I think it's worth kind of highlighting that the rough sleeping client group is an incredibly mobile group, and people move between local authorities, and that's some of the rationale for why there is a role for the GLA to play here in rough sleeping, in providing pan-London services, because we know that that's helpful in kind of evening out some of the service provision that exists there. And clearly there is quite a lot of differentiation in the numbers of rough sleepers between boroughs, and some outer London boroughs will have much lower numbers than inner London boroughs, and that will kind of in some cases lead to kind of different service offers from those authorities as well. And so the role that we're trying to play is playing that role in commissioning pan-London services where they're strategic or specialist or need to be delivered at a London level, but also working really, really closely in partnership with London councils, big L, big C, to support the boroughs to ensure that there's, wherever possible, there's kind of consistency and that needs are being met at the borough level as well.
Yeah, and that need for pan-London intervention and services is something which was highlighted by the first panel this morning. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. So you mentioned a number of the different programmes and also the amount of money allocated, which has increased from 8 million up to just over 36 million. My understanding is, though, that some of that is money that comes from government. So the actual mayoral funding has gone from 8 million to about 12, and that about almost 25 million comes from government. Do we know if that's definitely going to be continued? Is there any chance that that won't be continuing? Because one of the issues that came up this morning, apart from the mobility of people who ridiculously, for some unknown reason, decide they don't want to maintain a local connection by rough sleeping all over the place. I mean, who knew that that would be a thing? Are we going to continue to get this money so that we can continue with some of the programmes and the things that we're doing? Or is there a chance that the Youth Hub, SHAP, all of these programmes might fall away?
We certainly hope so. I think, as I mentioned earlier, everyone's in a bit of a holding pattern at the moment until we get to the autumn statement. And we think that the autumn statement is going to be a sort of single-year budget, whereas when we get to the spring, we will have the multi-year spending review. Yeah. So we do need some clarity, certainly before the spring, regarding RSI, because we've got services that will come to an end on the 31st of March next year. Yeah. And, even now, people will be thinking about, will I have a job, in April next year. So it is quite pressing. It's something that we are regularly raising with the department. I am cautiously...
Are they listening?
Cautiously optimistic that there will be something going forward, even if in terms of what we get in the next couple of weeks is only a 1 year rather than a 3-year settlement. Cautiously optimistic that there will be something for us.
OK, well, finding out in less than a fortnight that we've got funding for the next year would be extremely helpful. Otherwise, people are going to start looking for other jobs. But
it would be very helpful.
David was saying that the figures, and it will be helpful to have the borough breakdown that you just referred to, but you said that the Youth Hub has helped over 200 young people. The data since 2016 shows that more than 16,000 people have been helped through the Life Off the Streets programme. Assuming that the funding continues, assuming for 1 year, and then we get a multi-year settlement coming through in the spring settlement, what more can we do to make that programme even more successful?
Ooh, as in the youth hub specifically?
The whole Life Off the Streets programme. Because I think that's been really good at keeping people off the streets as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key thing will be what emerges from the new plan of action that we're putting together. And as I think David said earlier, we want to have more of a focus on prevention. It is harder for us in London specifically to do that because we don't have, of course, all the levers that are necessary. So much of what drives people onto the streets are policies related to welfare, related to immigration and things like that. But as part of the plan of action, we do want to think about what more we can do working with the government, working with London councils and our charity partners to do more on prevention, because obviously it is much better to prevent people from ending up on the streets. And we're very proud that we've helped. I think the figure now is more than 17,600 people. We're very proud that we've helped those people off the streets, but it would have been much better if they had not ended up on the streets in the first place.
Well, sure, and as we were also discussing this morning, not only does that then create the need for services to help them back off the streets, but also it impacts their health and
absolutely,
and the whole sort of family breakdown situation and all of those areas as well. So there's massive reasons for doing the preventative around homelessness as there is in doing more prevention around health.
And I think key to this will be what we can do in partnership with London councils, because as I mentioned earlier, if you're a single person and you turn up to a housing option service with the best will in the world, even with the duty to prevent, they're probably not going to be able to do anything for you, because they are, desperately trying to find accommodation to put the families with children that they have a statutory duty to help. So I think, working with London councils and the government, what more can we do so that when someone who is single and homeless turns up to a housing option service, they're not just told to go away, they are pointed in the direction of some sort of service that can help them, and that they don't have to go and sleep rough for a night just so they can qualify for assistance as a rough sleeper.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. How effective has the Mayor's Rough Sleeping Action Plan been since its launch in 2018, and what tangible outcomes can be attributed to this strategy? Just to be slightly tougher, because obviously we've seen a big rise in rough sleeping in London, and we know there's circumstances for that. But how is the strategy tried to mitigate that and respond to it?
Well, I think the success of the strategy has been in the numbers that I've already mentioned. So more than 17,600 people helped. 97% of people who are helped by No Second Night Out are not seen sleeping rough again. And, I think the whole plethora of services that we commission to support what the boroughs are doing as well is testament to the success of the plan of action. And, of course, we are now in the process of updating that plan of action to ensure it's now relevant for the situation we're in at the moment. Of course, it is extremely unfortunate that we have seen rising numbers of rough sleepers. David has talked about austerity, and I think that is has been undeniably a key driver of this. I mean, rough sleeping was falling up until 2010. We got down to very low numbers, and then since we've had austerity, the numbers have been rising, and I don't think you can sort of separate this out from what has been happening on the national level.
Yeah, I definitely we are, I'd argue, the biggest sort of magnet for rough sleeping in the country, so the national level is important to us. Just to add then, this morning we heard a lot of talk about the mayor potentially being powerful around his convening role to fill some of the gaps in the strategies. There was talk about how funds are spent. The rules will need to be changed centrally, and the mayor could act as a single voice. Does that feature in your strategy, the idea that the mayor can convene and act as a single voice?
So I think we do that already, and I think we can do more. I think that there is there's now a consensus between ourselves and London councils that the mayor should be taking more of a strategic role in this space. Obviously, we co-convene the Life Off the Streets work with London councils, and as part of the plan of action process, we are looking at our respective roles and responsibilities to determine, what makes most sense in terms of what sits where going forward. As Megan has said, we're talking about a population here that is very transient, that moves between borough boundaries. So there is I think a strong case for the mayor to be playing a continuing and possibly enlarged role in this space, particularly as local authorities are so swamped with their responsibilities for statutory homelessness.
But go ahead, Megan.
Yeah, so sorry, just to build on that, I was going to say that the rise in rough sleeping numbers, despite the successes that we've seen through our strategy, I think, just being completely honest, speaks to the limitations of our role and powers here, and the importance of us kind of continuing to enhance that strategic leadership role for the mayor, and thinking about not just what we can commission, provide directly, but what changes we want to see implemented from government, and really providing that kind of systems leadership. So thinking about what's happening from other institutions and organisations, and what changes do we want to see to benefits to ensure that young people are able to access PRS accommodation in the same way that older rough sleepers are. What changes do we want to see to the immigration system to stop some of those drivers to rough sleeping?
And I suppose my final question is, are those things encoded in the strategy, sort of what the mayor's asks would be, or do you not see the strategy as a place to put that?
I think you'll see through the plan of action what the mayor's sort of asks are. And I see this very much as sitting, it is going to be specifically about rough sleeping, but I also see it very much as sitting within that wider homelessness piece that the government is leading on, and complementary to the wider piece the government is leading on. But we're very clear that this commitment to end rough sleeping by 2030 is absolutely going to have to be done in partnership, and particularly in partnership with central government, also with London councils, also with the voluntary sector, but very, very clear that it needs to be a partnership with central government, because so many of the levers sit there.
Okay, thank you. Chair?
Thank you. Assemblymember Small-Edwards, I think. Oh, no?
Garbett.
Sorry, apologies. Garbett. I'm looking at the wrong bit.
Thanks. So just to ask about another strategy and element that the mayor's put forward to address rough sleeping. So I wanted to ask about the impact of the Pan-London Rough Sleeping Commissioning Framework in shaping the mayor's approach, and specifically, are there plans to kind of review and update it? And then I've got a few follow-ups.
I might bring David and Megan in on this one, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the existing commissioning framework, sets the parameters in terms of around what we commission. Yes, we will be looking at renewing this following the plan of action. There is a plan in terms of around that. The existing commissioning framework comes to an end at the end of this latest round of commissioning services. So yes, we will be looking to, review that.
Oh, so the work hasn't started to review it yet? You haven't started to look
Not yet, because we want to do that hand in hand with our, with the plan of action, looking at what our role is in relation to London councils, local authorities, in terms of around what's commissioned, what's not commissioned, what makes sense at pan London level. I think, as Megan said earlier, obviously our role is to kind of commission pan London services where it makes sense and to fill the gaps. I think we have possibly filled some gaps in the past that we maybe need others to help us fill, and maybe it'd be better for us to step back a little bit and allow others to fill some of those gaps. So I think that's something we'll be looking at in relation to the commissioning framework.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Everything that David has just said there. So I think there's just two really key things that are going on over the next 6 months that will feed into the review of that commissioning framework. The first is our plan of action, which we are kind of doing a lot of very active work at the moment, and we really want there to be a kind of meaningful consultation with our partners on what that plan of action is going to say, what the objectives are, what the activities are that are within that. And so if we were to start the commissioning stuff before then, it would be a bit cart before the horse. So that's the thinking there. But also just want to kind of underscore the importance of this multi-year spending review in the spring, and how important that will be for shaping the kind of response to rough sleeping going forward. And so there's a certain amount of kind of seeing how that plays out in the spring before we kind of leap into kind of reviewing the commissioning framework at this stage.
Great, because what I have heard from just speaking to people in this area in the panel this morning is that things are being pulled in many different directions. You've got, the government, with the asylum-seeking accommodation, the mayor's priority to end rough sleeping, and then, what's happening with the exempt supported accommodation and local authorities, evicting people onto the street. So I just wondered, Tom, if you could speak to that kind of tension and how plans are made within those kind of conflicting priorities.
Well, I think some of that tension is a product perhaps of the different political colours that we've had until very recently between the mayor and national government. I foresee that very much changing now that we have political alignment between the mayor and national government, and that we are both pushing in, I think and I hope, the same direction. So I can see some of these tensions being resolved simply through that. But as I said earlier, the work we're doing on the plan of action, it is rough sleeping specifically, but I want it to very much dock in with what the government is doing nationally on broader homelessness. The two are absolutely linked. There is a systems issue here. And I think it's very positive, as I said before, that the Deputy Prime Minister will be leading this work and can cut across multiple government departments, which should help to resolve some of the tensions that you've highlighted.
Yeah, absolutely, and definitely I think that will help in a kind of medium long term, but we obviously are approaching winter, and I think the providers are and people who support rough sleepers are incredibly worried about this winter period. And I know I just asked about the exempt supported accommodation piece and doing that work with London councils, but I would stress that that's they're crying out for that work to be done now in preparation for winter.
It's why we've made the plan of action an absolute priority, and it's why the work has already begun, and the call for evidence will formally go out later this month, and we hope to have the plan of action in place well within the first quarter of next year. So just to reassure you, it's absolutely a priority that we are working on at pace.
Great, and that will fold in that conversation with London councils on the exempt supported accommodation.
We've been having some very fruitful discussions with London councils.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I just wanted to ask you, you'll recall hopefully the report that the committee did a couple of years ago around supported and exempt accommodation called Regulating the Rogues, and that was with Crisis, who were here previously, and Bob Blackman, and we had really helpful input from Birmingham City Council and some providers who, for various reasons, wanted to remain anonymous, but they are providers in that space. And so one of the recommendations from that report was to look at a longer-term settlement for supported housing. And we've had the Affordable Homes Monitor recently, Affordable Housing Monitor recently, but one of the issues that we have all identified is that people providers have a reticence to take up the option of developing supported housing because it doesn't have revenue funding alongside it. So I just wonder, in practice, how we can actually make that recommendation a reality and how we can get providers to actually build that supported housing but guarantee them an income stream to provide support to their client group.
Well, I think the revenue funding is key. And, as I said before, it's something that we, are in discussion with, MHCLG about. I think we all want to see providers doing more supported accommodation. I hope, again, now that we've got some political alignment, we might be able to progress some of those discussions. And, of course, I'm sure the committee will want to make its representations to the government as well about this.
Just to add to that, I think the RSAP programme, so the Rough Sleeping Accommodation programme, which did bring together revenue and capital money for supported housing. I just wanted to make the point that that was incredibly successful, and the outputs from that programme, I understand, make up 12% of the rough sleeping accommodation supported housing stock in London. So I think that just demonstrates how the kind of level of success we can have where revenue and capital money is brought together, and we should absolutely be using that as a kind of example to government about the things that we can do when we have the right conditions in place. And the key point about that revenue funding is also not just that it's there. Clearly it's there for RSAP and SHAP, but only for a limited period of time. And I suppose that has an impact on providers' willingness to come forward because there isn't that long-term certainty about the revenue remaining there. So it's that the revenue money is there, but also that there's a kind of underpinning long-term sustainable model to give a certain degree of certainty on that going forward.
Absolutely, and I think a return to something like we used to have with the Supporting People funding that used to be available to local councils would be very, very welcome in terms of helping this client group.
It might be the case that you haven't done the numbers, but if we were to reinstate some kind of Supporting People for the 21st century, what would that look like for London to deal with this problem?
I don't have a ballpark figure. I don't know if David or Megan have any thoughts on that. We might be able to come up with something, but...
Yeah, we don't have it now, but yes, I think it's something we need to be looking at and also taking stock. Part of the work we're going to be looking at doing in terms of plan of action is in terms of a needs assessment to look at actually what supported housing is available and is out there across London to be able to have a better sense of what we've currently got, what we currently need, where the funding is, if you know, I mean, how long that funding is there for. I mean, as Megan said, if you know, I mean, RSAP has been extremely successful, SHAP is being successful. Both of those came out of the plan of action in 2018. They're one of the things that were mentioned in terms around the plan of action in 2018, as were the Roma support team, as was mental health outreach, many programmes that we have run that came from that original plan of action. And obviously the hope is for the next plan of action to have a further range of programmes and projects.
Assembly Member Turrell.
Thank you, Chair. Just directing these to Tom. The Mayor's committed to ending rough sleeping by 2030. Could you provide the committee with a bit more detail on how he's going to achieve this?
Absolutely. So, as I said, this is going to need to be a partnership approach. We absolutely do not hold all of the levers here at City Hall, or indeed across London Government, we don't hold all the levers. So we'll be working on this with London councils, with our charity partners, and crucially with the government as well. And the plan of action will be, I think, sort of the key component, the key early component in setting out how we are going to do this. But it is going to take a big collective effort, and we are going to have, as we've discussed already, more of a focus upstream on prevention. Obviously we still have to have a focus on helping people off the streets when they are on the streets, and we don't want to detract from that. But I do think we need to be looking at what more we can do upstream to stop people from ending up on the streets in the first place.
Yes, everything that Tom has just said. Just wanted to make the point that we will be seeking to structure that plan of action around the adopted indicators for ending rough sleeping. So around preventing it wherever possible, but where it's not possible to prevent it, making sure that it's rare, brief and non-recurrent. So that will structure some of the thinking about interventions, asks and services that sit under those key pillars.
It's also worth noting as well, in terms of how we go forward with this and the services that we commission, in London we have the best data in the country, if not the world, on rough sleeping through our chain database. And we will, very much be ensuring that the data from that is informing the kind of services that continue to inform the kind of services that we commission.
Yeah, thank you. And coming off the back of that, are there any new measures coming forward, and do you have a timescale for these you can share with the committee?
Yes, so the Mayor has committed to expanding the network of No Second Night Out hubs. Also, I think we're possibly transitioning that to calling them ending homelessness hubs. So we have a commitment across the term to an additional £10 million from the GLA to go into these hubs to help people. So that will be one of the key things that we do. But beyond that, I think that in terms of the services that we look at commissioning going forward, a lot of that will be dependent on the plan of action and on the outcomes of this work that we're doing with London councils to determine what sits where, essentially. Where does the GLA add value, and where do boroughs sit? And we're also looking as well at what we can do on a sub-regional level. We have 5 sub-regions in London, and I think it perhaps makes sense for those to be commissioning services that are complementary to what we're doing and what the boroughs are doing.
Thank you. And then finally for me, before I hand back to the Chair, thinking specifically about homelessness caused by Section 2021 notices. You'll no doubt be aware about the case in my constituency. It came up with County House. Can you just provide reassurances that conversations are happening with other providers in this scheme to make sure there aren't any repeats of this as other schemes come to an end?
It's certainly the only example that I'm aware of. It's obviously deeply, deeply unfortunate. I will be responding to your letter, of course. I wrote to Hyde as soon as I became aware of the situation and impressed upon them what my expectations are regarding supporting the people who unfortunately will be made homeless. And yes, I'll be responding to your letter shortly.
Thank you for that. Back to you, Chair.
Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. Earlier on, we were able to ask the first panel, who were mostly from the voluntary sector, and then also somebody from London councils, about data. And so I was asking about, the autumn figures and then also about the chain data. And while they said that chain is one of the best data sets around, it also has limitations. And Jasmine from Crisis was saying that they'd done some work in Brent and there'd been a sort of 30% discrepancy, and that was backed up by other comments as well. Given the GLA's support of the women's rough sleeping census, and Jasmine was making the point about the need to get out into the community and really sort of interrogate what's going on with people, do you think it will make any difference to the way that the chain data is collected? Do you think we need to make the chain data more gender informed?
I certainly think that the chain, as you've mentioned, is the sort of best data set in the country, and as I say, if not the world. And other cities around the world sort of get in touch. And I spoke at Bloomberg organised a summit of mayors at which I spoke about chain, and there was a lot of interest from cities around the world in the data set. Obviously, if there are any discrepancies in that data, we'd want to sort them out, and we'd always constantly want to be improving the data that we have. But I do think that it is, the best certainly in the country.
See, one of the things that I found, I was just going to throw this in and then come on to you then, David. One of the things that I found was during the pandemic, and obviously I was an Assembly member at that time, was that I started being contacted directly. My number's available on the council websites. I also sit as a councillor as well as an Assembly member. And once one or two people had contacted me about trying to sort out accommodation, I mean, it must have gone through some sort of network of people, although some of them seemed to be unrelated, so I don't know whether it was just desperation. And there seemed to be a whole subset of people who probably wouldn't be appearing in rough sleeping figures at all. Most of them seem to be sleeping in their cars. They all seem to be in this situation because of relationship breakdowns. Quite a lot of them were men. It was extremely, and I got a lot of them referred through Spear, was the local organisation that was taking the referrals, and obviously then had to try and pinpoint where their car was likely to be parked, which obviously again is a mobile situation. So it's obvious that, and I think it was the colleague from London Councils who said, you know, the data shows 1,000 people sleeping rough on any one night in London, and yet when we came to do everyone in, we were housing 7,000 people. So who are these other 6,000 people? Now, perhaps I was speaking to some of the people who are in that 6,000 who are, you know, gone through relationship breakdown and now sleeping in their car. They want to stay in a particular area because they still want to be able to go to see their kids, or, you know, they want to get to work, but they are homeless, aren't they? So what can we do to really improve on, you know, that's 6,000 people, isn't it? There's a gap there.
Yeah, you've hit upon a very important point in relation to hidden homelessness. And I remember back when I was on the committee, we did a report into hidden homelessness. I think it actually was one of the best reports that the committee did. I think it found that 13 times as many people were hidden homeless as were sleeping rough on the streets. And obviously it's quite difficult to pin that down because by their very nature, they are hidden. I think there are some perverse sort of incentives, as it were, within the system that we've got, where unless you're a verified rough sleeper, you can't access services. So what that does is you end up with people, you know, having to sleep rough for a night in order to then, you know, be helped by a service, where actually wouldn't it be much better if they could just be helped before having to go and spend the night on the street? And I think that's something that we will be grappling with as part of the work on the plan of action. Do you want to say any more on sort of chain and the data and homelessness, David?
Yeah, no, that would be great. Thanks, Tom. Yes, just to echo everything Tom said, we'll say in terms of round chain and making changes to chain, following the first women's census, we made some changes to chain in terms of round where people can be recorded rough sleeping. So you can now be recorded rough sleeping if you're in a fast food restaurant, you can be recorded rough sleeping if you are seen in your car. So outreach teams have the ability to kind of verify people in different situations. And obviously from the latest women's census and the young person census, we'll be looking at whether there are other changes that we need to make to the chain system to ensure the data is as robust as it can be. Obviously, if you know, I mean, this is very much a database that is provided by outreach. If you know, when outreach workers fill in this data, we need to make sure that the data we're requesting from them is meaningful, is useful. If you know, I mean, I think most outreach teams probably have a little voodoo doll of me every time I'm like, I'm just adding we're adding a new field on chain for this, and they're like, why? Why exactly? I'm out here seeing, if you know what I mean, seeing this client, I want to be able to help them. Is this data going to actually help change the system? And I think that's where we want to be able to use chain more strategically, is actually where do we need to commission services more effectively. We've recently, in the last...
I think that's the only point for doing it, though, isn't it?
Yes.
Because otherwise everyone's just collecting data and then saying, oh, look, people are sleeping rough.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just do that, there's no point at all.
There is no point at all. And I think that, if not, and we've got the strategic insights tool where we're bringing together chain data, HCLIC data, which is the data local authorities fill out in terms of when someone presents rough sleeping, and also inform data, which is the data when someone actually enters a hostel. So what we're trying to do with this is actually look at that insight across the pathway. Where are people pitching up for housing options, not receiving an offer, then sleeping rough? If you know, when are hostels working effectively when someone comes off chain and then goes into inform? So being able to pull that data together, and now we have that tool, we can pull in other data sets. So we could potentially look at health data, we could potentially look at DWP data, bringing this data together, like you say, strategically to go, actually, who should we be targeting resources at? Where can we move into more that prevention space? I think is something that we definitely need to do. But going back to the kind of pandemic, yes, if you know what I mean, we did see a lot of people that were hidden homeless coming in. I remember the meeting where I argued with Robert General Fenrick and Louise Casey right at the start.
What's happened to him? I haven't heard about him recently.
Louise, were you, David?
No, Louise was backing me up, but where in terms of looking at what we needed at that stage, and I was like, look, we look at the data, you look at who was rough sleeping, you look at who was in the winter, who was in hostel accommodation, shared hostel accommodation at that time, and we estimated it to be about 3,000 people that we need to provide accommodation for. It ended up being 17,000 people that we accommodated. Obviously, that was during a pandemic. If you were sofa surfing in someone's house during that time, you can totally understand someone being, actually, I'm not that comfortable with you being here, actually you need to be going somewhere else. So we definitely saw that rise, and I think Tom's right, we need to be more effective in being able to provide those services earlier, those prevention services. That might mean that actually it looks like we're helping less people when it comes to mayoral services in terms of actually presenting rough sleeping, because we've helped people in that prevention space. So I think the indicators are key in terms of around how we actually measure and monitor what we're doing to say, actually, we've prevented X amount of people from rough sleeping, we're helping these long-term rough sleepers. We need to be more effective than just going, it's a single night count, this is how many people that we're seeing rough sleeping in London.
Yeah, and just to add to that, sorry, I just wanted to highlight one specific service that we commission, which is the outreach on public transport. So people who are sleeping on buses, night buses, for example.
Well, I was just going to say, you mentioned sofa surfing, but we also know on public transport as well, and I've already mentioned in cars, and it's preventing those people from getting into the system. And the idea that someone's got to go and sleep on a street corner or under a bush for one night to be able to access services has to be the most ridiculous, perverse incentive going. Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Garbett.
Thank you. In the panel earlier on, we heard people's reflections on the Renters' Rights Bill, and they were quite clear in saying they didn't think it was going to make an immediate difference to rough sleeping. They can't see the kind of immediate link. And I just wanted to put that to you, really, to think, to see how that was featuring in some of your planning and any discussions you're having with the Deputy Prime Minister about the coordination between the departments.
I mean, I certainly think it's going to help. I mean, we know, I haven't quite got the figures in front of me, but, you know, there's a large proportion of people who end up on the streets who have previously been in a private rented tenancy. I know at one point the end of a private rented tenancy was the leading cause of homelessness in general, not rough sleeping specifically, but homelessness in general. So I do think that the provisions within the bill are going to help people and to make a difference. But it's also part of a wider piece. You know, it's not just about having the security of tenure, which is very important. It's also about people being able to afford their rent, and that's where things like, you know, the welfare piece comes in for people who are reliant on universal credit or housing benefit to stay in their accommodation. So it's part of a broader piece, but I certainly think that it is really, really important.
They were obviously positive that it's, you know, ending Section 21 evictions was obviously seen as a positive, but it was more that they couldn't see. They were talking about kind of confidence in being able to seek the support and challenge your landlord. Like, it depends quite a lot on people's confidence to do that, which I think is huge, because, you know, a lot of what they were talking about is that people currently leave tenancies just if they're given a notice, and just people's, you know, not having that confidence to challenge that decision, and also the kind of lack of in-tenancy protection. Yeah. So obviously some positives, but I think, yeah, and it's just how that kind of features in
Two things on that. Firstly, I think that what they were calling the portal, which is now the database, is going to be really, really important, because that is an excellent resource that I hope local authorities will be able to use to directly reach out. I think that, you know, directly reach out to private renters in their borough. And what I hope local authorities will do is use that data to reach out to private renters in the borough and say, these are your rights. If you get an eviction notice, you don't have to leave just because you've got the eviction notice. You can challenge it. The landlord can't evict you for no reason. And the second thing, which is that renters will now be able to make effective use of the mechanism which already exists to challenge ridiculous rent rises. So the mechanism already exists, but nobody uses it, partly, I think, because people aren't aware of it, but also partly because the landlord can just evict you if you were to challenge the rent. You will now be able to go to your local authority and to get them to determine what a fair rent is. And an important change in that regard as well is that previously the rent could go up. The local authority could decide your rent was too low. That won't be the case anymore. It can only stay the same or go down. And I think that these are important provisions that I hope that the good local authorities will be telegraphing to their private renters. That does also raise a question, of course, of resourcing for local authorities, because all of this piece and the stuff under the Homelessness Reduction Act, it is a resource intensive for local authorities, and local authorities need to be resourced properly in order to be able to carry out this role.
Yeah, and do you see a role for the mayor, or will this be folded into this action plan? Because obviously it was highlighted, as issues in our first panel.
So, I mean, in terms of what we do on PRS, obviously we've got the rogue landlord and agent checker, we've got the property licence checker, which have been quite effective. I think the key role here will be for local councils. We are interested in a role in landlord licensing. It wouldn't be the mayor, being the licensing authority, as it were. It would be the mayor setting out some sort of broad guidance and principles that all boroughs in London should follow as they go about setting up their licensing schemes. So we do envisage a role for the GLA in terms of setting out some broad pan-London principles on that, subject to licensing being devolved, which I think that's very much the direction of travel, just a matter of time.
Great, thank you. And just to ask another quick question on just kind of wider multiple needs of the people within the rough sleeping population. Obviously, some people in the rough sleeping population will be using drugs, and I know that this features in some of your planning, but some areas of the country are moving to a much more, and some hostels are moving to a much more kind of harm reduction approach through their kind of hostel provision, so that people are able to use drugs in a supported way, because obviously there's a huge crisis in the kind of toxicity of the drug supply, more people dying in hostels across the country. So I just wondered if that's something that you've been thinking about in terms of how we can support accommodation to take a kind of harm reduction approach.
I might pass over to David or Megan on this one. I mean, broadly speaking, I am in favour of a harm reduction approach in general. I just think that as a broad principle that is a good thing. But in terms of the specifics of our services, I might pass over to David.
Yes, in relation to hostel provision, there are a lot of in-reach that goes in from drug and alcohol services, and I recently went to an event that Turning Point were putting on in terms of in-supported accommodation around synthetic opioids and the concern in terms of around that, and harm minimisation, and giving advice in terms of around that. So there are a number of good, borough good practice that happens where the, treatment services go into hostels, explain to them the harm minimisation approach, and work very closely with the hostel provider in terms of around that. When I used to work in Westminster, one of the pieces of work I did was working with the police in terms of around drugs found on the premises. What should we do? Developing a protocol in relation to that, so that hostel providers had that, so they were comfortable that if they did find substances, within the accommodation, they weren't at risk if they then took those substances off that individual and put it in a safe. They weren't at risk in terms of around prosecution. So I think there's more work that we can, that can be done. But there are pockets of excellent practice across the system where that work happens. But unfortunately, it's not necessarily uniform across the system. And obviously, boroughs commission their local hostels, and they also commission for public health their drug and alcohol services. So I think it's what we can do more in terms of the plan of action to indicate that we want to see more of this joint work.
Yeah, that's brilliant to hear, because I think that taking that pan-London approach and making sure that that's the way forward is, really, really important. Obviously, recognising those differences, but I just think, I think we can all agree that someone being kind of made homeless for their drug use, obviously they're much more protected being in a service and being able to access that support. That's good to hear, but if it can be made more consistent would be great. Thanks.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions, and then I think we might wrap up. Mine was actually related to hostels too, but from a slightly different perspective. So obviously this is the main mechanism for local authorities to provide immediate housing to rough sleepers where they're able to. I guess I take a slightly different perspective in the sense that, at least from casework, it seems that a lot of the hostel accommodation that we have now, because of the scarcity of it, hostels have been forced to close, and so where once upon a time you'd have had, for example, wet hostels, now they're kind of much more mixed. And I kind of think of a couple of cases of women who were survivors of domestic abuse who weren't able to be placed in borough because their hostels were mixed hostels, so no single-sex hostels, and also there was a concern about sharing space with drug and alcohol users. So I just wonder, in that the original comment that you made around revenue funding and commissioned specialist services in order to tackle the problem of rough sleeping and support, what the breakdown of that might be across the different types of need. Because I take the point that Assembly Member Garbutt has made around not criminalising people, but nevertheless that is a harm that's done to a neighbour in the same hostel.
So in terms of the service, I mean, these things will be dependent, firstly, on how much funding we get, and secondly, of course, what the data tells us about what the need is, including the specific need for women. I think this does speak to, I think your point does speak to the important place that the GLA has in commissioning those more pan-London services that people can access, in particular for specific groups like women, where it might not make sense for a borough to have a specific service because the numbers are so low, but of course in that particular borough, but of course on a London-wide level, it's absolutely necessary. So I think that question speaks to the importance of us being data-led and the role that the GLA can play in adding services that complement what the boroughs are providing, and also noting that, of course, boroughs have been hammered so hard by cuts that they have such an issue with statutory homelessness that a lot of them aren't able to perhaps offer the same level of support for single homeless people that they once did.
Just to add that the other, so part of my team is David and rough sleeping, but the other half, or a large part of the rest of the team, is working on the domestic abuse safe accommodation programme. That's a statutory duty that sits under the Mayor. So I just wanted to make the point that we have a new draft strategy on that out for consultation at the moment. And one of the things that the needs assessment picks up is exactly as you say, Chair, around the kind of increasing complexity of needs for women who've experienced, survivors of domestic abuse. And so some of the thinking that we're doing in terms of commissioning off the back of that draft strategy is around how we meet the kind of complex needs around rough sleeping, as well as mental health and drug and alcohol use through the domestic abuse provision across London as a whole.
Yeah, because you can imagine a situation where a woman has fled her home and the only option is to sleep on the streets, and then is turning down accommodation because it doesn't meet a requirement. Okay, that's really helpful. I just wanted to also ask you, Tom, back to the point about rents. The Mayor has London living... So it's something that you said, Assemblymember Garbutt, around rents. It's gone out of my mind. But the Mayor has London living rent, which is a third of local income by ward, and it's updated every year. And most boroughs have a version of living rent, which is appropriate to their borough, but is generally the same as the Mayor's. Were it the case that rents could be, how would we kind of make sure that people are working towards a number like that? Is that an achievable aim for providers or of accommodation to kind of work towards that as a target?
So, yes, I mean, the living rent is, of course, a really important tenure that the Mayor has introduced. We're also about to start consulting on the Mayor's manifesto commitment for what was called in the manifesto rent control homes might not end up being called rent control homes, but these are the key worker
for my constituency.
The key worker housing, and that will probably have a different rent setting mechanism, but we would really welcome the committee's thoughts on that when the consultation comes out, as we would welcome your thoughts on the DASA strategy and, of course, on the rough sleeping plan of action when we do a call for evidence on that.
Did you want to come in, or you're fine? Okay. And this is just some tying up loose ends. So at the top of this section, Assembly Member Garbett mentioned young people, and we also about providing data. So we'd be grateful if you could provide that. But if you could also provide a breakdown of non-UK nationals and refugees, or those with no recourse to public funds, in terms of the proportion and the amount or programme spent on each. That'd be really helpful.
Yes, we can do that. And I think from memory, David, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we've seen now for the first time non-EU nationals outnumbering EU nationals who are on the street. So there's been a bit of a demographic shift in recent years. But we can provide all of that data to the committee.
That would be really helpful. And I just wondered what our use of the data store is now, whether this is something which is better for you to report to the committee, because it sounds quite dynamic. Because
it's all published. I mean, all of the data is published by Homeless Link, I think.
No, we publish the data.
We publish the data on the data store. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think just to add in terms of around the non-UK national piece is, I think, as a sector, we've come a long way in terms of round actually the vast majority of people that we're working with have unclear entitlements. If you know what I mean, they're not no recourse to public funds, and the more work we do with them, and the fact that we've been able to provide through RSI, specialist immigration advice, if you know, as part of our services, I think is a key thing that we need to be making sure we're building on, because actually the vast majority of people, as Tom said, if you know, are leaving home office accommodation with status. They have status. We should be able to provide the solutions for this group. It's not we're working with people who are no recourse to public funds, where it is a lot more tricky to provide solutions. So I think that's something we need to be building upon.
And was that the group of people that you said that the GLA has been providing services, but perhaps other people should be?
I think it's more that we could as a system, we should be able to prevent people from leaving home office accommodation and ending up rough sleeping. Okay. Obviously, like I say, providing that specialist immigration advice, we provide that as early as possible to people during that process. But actually having that commissioned specifically for those people that are rough sleeping or at risk of rough sleeping, I think has been a major thing that we've done over the past couple of years.
Okay, thank you. I was just wondering who you meant when you said that. That's helpful. My final request is, you know, we love a heat map and the Housing Committee, so the borough breakdown that Assembly Member Small Edwards was discussing with specific regard to Westminster, if that was something that we could have for all boroughs, that would be really welcome.
Yes, I think if we could do it for Westminster, we can do it for every borough. So, yeah, we'll come back to you on that.
Thank you very much. So that concludes our questions, and we're a little ahead of time now, which is wonderful. So I want to thank you all for your contributions. Can we, as a committee, note the report and today's discussion? Noted. Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion? Can we note the committee's work programme?
Noted.
The date of the next meeting of the committee is the 12th of November 2024 at 10 a.m. In the chamber here at City Hall. I have no urgent business and I declare this meeting closed.